This morning, we're continuing our journey. If you didn't, oh, hang on. I've got the clicker, mate. We're continuing our journey in the book of Ruth. If you didn't work that out from the whole chapter that was read for you so well. And because this is one of those books, this is one of those stories in the Bible, as I said last week, that kind of has your head scratching and kind of like sitting there going, what? How on earth? Oh my gosh. I have affectionately, and you've seen a sneak preview, called this series stRUTH. It's good. Thank you. I still enjoy that. Visitors, do we like that? Thank you. It's good. Good pun. This morning we're up to chapter 2. And if you weren't here last week, please, as always, go back and listen to last week's message and catch up. But for those of you who are visiting, or who may not go and catch up, I will give you a bit of a recap. Last week was very much, it was chapter 1, it was very much the opening scene of this story. And it's a scene, don't be fooled by the word Ruth or the title of the book Ruth. The opening scene was very much centered around a character by the name of Naomi. Now, Naomi has found herself at absolute rock bottom, okay? Imagine this. She's lost her husband. Some of you are like, gee, that doesn't sound like rock bottom to me. He was a good husband. She's lost her husband. She's lost her 2 sons. And more importantly, she's lost her integrity. She's decided to go and live in Moab, which was Israel's sworn enemy, because things had gotten a little hard, a little tight in Israel. And so she was a dissenter. She'd gone to live with the enemy because things had gotten hard. But she found out through word of mouth and just general news after a while that God, oh, hang on, pause. Karis, I totally forgot. Okay. Sorry. Man, I've got a bad memory. This is why we have an executive pastor. But I failed to tell her, and that was the problem. Sorry. All right. We'll keep going with the story. Sorry, Karis. Okay, so Naomi is in Moab. She's decided to move back to Israel, okay? And as she's on her way, with her 2 daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, she kind of has this epiphany. She kind of realizes, hang on, the life that I'm going back to in Israel, because I've dissented, because I've gone and lived with the enemy, because I'm single, I don't have a husband, I don't have sons, I live in a patriarchal society, I'm pretty much coming back to a life as a destitute beggar. That's literally what welcomes Naomi as she comes back to Israel. And so on the way, she kind of has this double take and she goes, man, this is not good for me. But even worse will be for my daughter-in-laws, right? Because they are Moabites. They are the enemy. And so she kind of thinks, man, this is not good. And so she says, halfway on the way back to Bethlehem, she says to her daughter-in-laws, you need to turn around. You need to go back. You need to go back to Moab. That's where you've got the best chance of security. That's where you've got a good chance of finding another husband. You've got future prospects. All of these things. You're going to be a loathed foreigner here in Israel, so you need to turn and go back to Israel, Moab. And so Naomi has success in convincing one of her daughter-in-laws, okay, Orpah. And so Orpah turns around and says, okay, I'm off. I'm going to go, meet Mr. Right. But Ruth, not so much. You see, Ruth makes the gutsy decision, which honestly, if you are a parent or a friend onlooking, you're like, no, this is a dumb decision. She makes the gutsy decision to instead travel with Naomi back to Israel, back to a foreign country, in order that she may support, commit, be loyal to her mother-in-law in trying to help her eke out an existence as a destitute beggar. It was a very bold gesture, to say the least. And one of the lingering questions as we finished chapter 1 last week is, what do you do, what do we do when pain and tragedy strike. What do we do? Do we stand firm and do we trust Yahweh? Trust that He will provide and bless for His children? Or do we allow what we can see, what we think is possible, to determine God's ability to come through for us? You see, in the middle of Naomi's pain and tragedy, she assumes because God hasn't rescued her yet, because she's at rock bottom, He's obviously abandoned her. That because she's still finding things difficult, He's obviously not coming through. And so rather than use her pain and use her tragedy to cling to God, to cling to Yahweh tighter, she uses it to become bitter. And the author highlights for us at the end of chapter 1, as Naomi, having been on the receiving end of this incredible gesture from Ruth, right? This incredible display of loyal, undeserved love. Even though she's the recipient of this, as she comes back into town, into Bethlehem, the people say, "Oh my gosh, is that you, Naomi?" And she says, "Yeah, but don't call me Naomi, call me bitter." She's still wallowing in her bitterness. And this is where we pick up the story in chapter 2, verse 1. So I'll read for you verse 1. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth and influence of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Everyone say Boaz. Love that name. So chapter 2 begins by introducing us to a man by the name of Boaz. Now, at this stage, we don't know anything about Boaz. Just out of interest, who knows the story of Ruth? Let me see a hand if you know the story. Okay, a decent chunk. Just pretend you don't know the story of Ruth, right? Sometimes I wish I could go back to the Bible, right, and read it for the first time and be amazed for the first time. Because sometimes we just go, yeah, I know where this is going, right? And we miss some of the amazing parts and developments of the story. So all we know at this stage about Boaz is that he's what is called a Hayil Gabor. All right, so the Bible was written in Hebrew, and in the original language, this verse is called a Hayil Gabor. And basically what this means is three things. Firstly, it means that he's loaded, all right? He's got lots of money. Secondly, it means that he has significant influence in society, so he's a mover and a shaker. And thirdly, it means he's morally upright. Okay, so this word Hayil Gabor, a worthy man, means that he's loaded, he's morally upright, and he's got a lot of clout in society. Now, one of the things that we've got to ask ourselves is, why does the author bother giving us this specific detail that he's a Hayil Gabor? That he's a mighty man or a worthy man. Now, for those of you who didn't see week one, those of you who did, answer me this question. What did we say was the setting for the book of Ruth? What was the setting? There were two things. It was in the time... I'm glad no one listens in our church. Just so you know, you don't have to listen now. It was in the time of the judges, right? And what did we say characterized this rule of the judges?
In and out of obedience.
Good. So it was characterized by sin and defiant disobedience. All right. So that was the setting to this story. And yet, here is this Hayil, I can't even say this, Hayil Gabor, this worthy man. Think about this. We've got a worthy man in a time of period where it was characterized by sin and disobedience. I mean, what are the chances that there would be this worthy man? What are the chances that there would be a worthy man that came from the very little clan that Naomi married into, right? And all of these, what are the chances, all these coincidences, the author wants you to pay attention to, because they're going to keep piling up and up and up. Verse 2. So the narrator stops talking and he goes back to the characters' dialogue, right? And remember we said last week that one of the ways that ancient authors emphasize their point is by putting dialogue in their characters' mouth. And so here we have a prime example of this. You see, Ruth is about to say something to Naomi that on the surface seems insignificant, but as we unpack the detail, this deliberately inserted dialogue actually is super crucial to the message of this chapter. Let's read verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess. Notice the author continues to emphasize Ruth's ethnic background. Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I might find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. Okay, so Ruth says something here that's super prominent in regards to what the author's trying to show us. She says, please let me go into the field and glean among the ears of grain, or among the stalks of grain. Now, gleaning was the process by which a person in ancient times, in ancient Israel, could go into a field that had already been harvested, and any bits and pieces that were left over that the harvester missed, they could glean for themselves. Now, harvesting had a number of steps and processes, but essentially, you started with a field that looked like this, right? Seen fields like this. And then you ended up, having harvested this field, with a field that looks like this. With all piles of sheaves. Each one of those is a pile of sheaves everywhere, with grain that was now ready to be processed and threshed. And after the field had been harvested, kind of like when you whip a snip or mow, how often do you find that there's a little cheeky stalk here or there? There's something that you've missed, right? Well, it's these bits, not if you're Stacey here. She doesn't miss anything. If you need a good mow. Anyway. These are the bits. In between these pile of sheaves, there would be little bits and pieces here and there. And they're the stalks of grain that gleaners were allowed to help themselves to, that they're allowed to themselves harvest. Now, the reality is this. While there were certainly bits and pieces that got missed, it wasn't a huge amount, right? I mean, if it was, that reaper/harvester would be out of a job pretty quick. It wasn't a big amount. It wasn't like gleaners could make it big by gleaning. In fact, most scholars, I want you to catch this, said that after a full day of gleaning, right, full day of gleaning, that they would probably end up with enough food for half a portion of one meal. Think about what you had for breakfast or what you're going to have for lunch. Half of that, and that's all you get for the day after a whole day's worth of gleaning. And so gleaners were really doing this, right, as a last resort to kind of fend off starvation. Not because they thought there was any great kind of opportunity in this, right? And so given their status and lack of resource, given the fact that Naomi is old, Ruth gets up early and she goes off to glean. But I want you to notice something because this is significant. Ruth says, let me go and glean among the ears of grain or the stalks of grain that have been left behind. Now, the Hebrew word for stalk or ear of grain is the word bar shibolim. Everyone say bar shibolim. Bar shibolim. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, what's so significant about this word, stalk of grain? What's so significant? Where else is she going to glean grain from, right? If not from a stalk of grain. Well, this is the very point. There is nowhere else to glean grain from, right? But for a genre, and we discussed this last week, the Bible is a genre that is characterized by being very sparse with detail on purpose, for a genre that uses detail sparingly, we have to pay attention to the fact that the author has gone to the bother of stating the obvious, right? It would be kind of like saying they walked back to Bethlehem and then adding pointless detail like, and they used their feet to walk. You're kind of like, yeah, and? But as we discovered last week, right, there are no pointless details in the Bible, amen? So remember that word, shibolu. All right, let's keep going. We'll come back to that. So Ruth sets out for a big day of gleaning. Verse 3. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was in the family of Elimelech. Now, it's useful to know that unlike our modern property designs, where people live on their farm or we have multiple separate farms, in ancient Israel, there was one massive geographic region or field where all of the farming was done, right? And so you have these huge farming areas. Now, Adam always teases me when I get here on a Sunday morning, like, oh, I'm so not ready. Oh, I'm so under the pump. Well, you'll be able to tell from the next slide. Hand drawn by yours truly. And this is basically what an ancient field looked like, right? It was this huge geographic region that had multiple little portions that were owned by different people. And so Adam might own a piece, Karis might own a piece, Rachel would definitely own a piece. But as a gleaner, right, you would wander throughout this region, throughout this field, and throughout the day, you would often wander on and off portions of land that were owned by a whole variety of people, right? You follow? And so Ruth is on her gleaning journey, has come to this particular portion that happened to be owned by Boaz. And the text says in Hebrew, literally, as luck would have it, right? There's another coincidence. She happens to find herself on this portion of field owned by Boaz. Verse 4. Now behold, again, the Hebrew translates literally as lo and behold, as in this is a total fluke, like I can't believe this happened. But as she's there, Boaz himself, another coincidence, happens to come by in his weekly dropping. And he says, verse 4, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? All right, so Ruth, by total fluke, happens to be on Boaz's portion of land. By total fluke, she happens to be there just at the right time when Boaz does his weekly check-in. And like I said, I hope you're beginning to see all these coincidences stack up on each other. Like the author keeps highlighting these, so we ask ourselves, hang on, all of these coincidences are starting to sound eerily like providence, right? And not just coincidence. Well, Boaz rocks up, and as he checks in with his foreman, he immediately notices this stranger, Ruth, right? He immediately notices her in amongst his employees. I mean, he hired Darren, right? He hired Jenny. He knows these employees. And then it's like, who is this lady? And so he literally says that to the foreman. He says, who's that? And the foreman's response is the crucial moment of this entire chapter, verse 6. It says, the servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. All right, so the author is still emphasizing in every mention of Ruth, right, that she's a Moabite. She's a foreigner. Keep that in mind. And then he tells us of the encounter that he has had with Ruth. And he says this in verse 7. And she said, as in Ruth said this, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she can and has remained from morning until now, except for a short rest in the house. Now, if you haven't read this story before, even if you have read this story before, or it's the first time you've read it, let me ask you a question. What is your impression of what's going on in this sentence? When it says, and she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from morning until now, except for a short rest in the house. What's happening here? Someone yell out.
She's working hard.
Great, she's working hard, and pretty much, as the text seems to say in English, that she's been gleaning, right? She's been doing the job. She's been gleaning from early in the morning until Boaz rocks up, right? Except for a little break in the house. The problem with that is it's nothing like what's actually going on in the Hebrew. So let me walk you through a couple of things because we end up with a very different translation. Firstly, the last phrase about the house has confused translators for a very, very long time because the Masoretic text, which is the original script that it was written in Hebrew, the Masoretic text for that last line, except for a short rest in the house, literally says this. You see how you do with this. This, her sitting, the house a little. I mean, meaning's not apparently obvious, right? This, her sitting, the house a little. However, numerous leading scholars believe actually what the foreman's saying here, rather than that translation, is a bit of a rhetorical / sarcastic joke from the foreman about Ruth's own house. That he's saying something more akin to this. Ha! Her house has meant little to her today. Now, that sounds like an odd thing to say until we further understand the rest of what's happening in this verse. Remember the word for gleaning that we talked about before? Anyone remember it off the top of your head? Pretty good. I wasn't expecting that. Bar shiloh, right? Stalks of grain. And we were wondering, why is the author stating the obvious? Why are they clearly using this word to almost say, the same thing twice? Well, we get our answer. Because what the foreman says that Ruth asks him is identical to what Ruth tells Naomi she's off to do. In the intro, remember, can I go and glean behind blah, blah, blah? It's identical, the two accounts, except for this word bar shibolim. You see, instead of the word bar shibolim, which is the word for stalks of grain, we get the word bar amarim, which means sheaves of grain. Now, remember what a harvested field looked like? Sheaves of grain all over the field, right? And that's bar amarim, right? Sheaves in amongst a harvested field. Bar amarim. Compare that to the unharvested bits of stalk or grain that might be poked up or have been left in amongst those sheaves, in amongst those bar amarim, and those things are called bar shibolim. Here's the grenade. You ready for it? Ruth hasn't asked the foreman to glean among the leftover stalks of grain, among the unharvested stalks of grain, which was the custom. She has asked to glean from the harvested sheaves. This is huge, right? You see, often we have a picture in our mind, and I did for 30-something years, of Ruth, this quiet little meek, gentle, lovely Ruth. But the audacity and the boldness of this request would have literally been bordering rude. And this is why the text says, see if I can quickly go back to it. This is why the text says, please let me glean and gather among the reapers, among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from morning until now. The Hebrew word for remained literally means to stand and wait. And so rather than gleaning and working hard from morning until now, what she's been doing has been standing there waiting for an answer to her crazy, audacious request of the foreman. And because he wasn't about to grant this crazy request, he sat tight and done nothing. And wow, thank goodness you're here, Boaz. I'm handballing this one to you. And so his comment about the house suddenly makes sense. He's saying to Boaz, this Moab, this foreigner, hello, do they not know the custom? She has asked to glean among the harvested sheaves. Think about this. It's like blackberry picking, right? You know how annoying they are to flip and get the blackberries and thorns and it takes like forever just to get like 6 blackberries. It's like her coming along and saying, you know what? I don't want to like glean from the blackberries that have dropped or the ones that are really hard at the back that the harvesters didn't want. You see your massive collection fruit bowl right there that you've spent hours collecting these blackberries. Hey, how about I glean from those bad boys? That's what she's asking. And so when it comes to this comment about the house, he's like, man, this Moabite woman, she's asked to glean among the sheaves, and she's been standing here from early morning until now waiting for a response. And then he goes, her house has meant nothing to her today. I.e., she's that pig-headed and stubborn that she's not going anywhere till she gets a response. You know, in many ways, this is the major theme of this chapter. Having made this bold declaration, the scene before to Naomi, that where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God's my gods. You know that wonderful monologue? Having made that crazy commitment to her verbally, now she's ready to actually act with that bold and outlandish commitment. Knowing she has no capacity in her own foreign beggar status to provide for Naomi through gleaning, she throws her trust over to Yahweh and she begins to put herself in bold and audacious scenarios that only He can control. Amen? You see, Ruth begins to display what scholar Robert Hubbard Jr. calls risk-taking devotion. Risk-taking devotion. And I love this. This is not the kind of generic commitment, right, that Elimelech, her husband we met in the previous chapter, showed when he buckled under pressure because things got hard in Israel. This isn't the kind of generic commitment or devotion that gives up after, a year of praying. That seems like a long time, God. This is not the kind of generic devotion that says, well, you know what, I'll come to church when I'm not too busy, when my kids don't have footy or, when things work on my schedule. This is not the kind of generic devotion that says, I'll serve the kingdom of God. I'll serve God with my money or my time or my resource when it's in surplus. No, that's not the kind of devotion that this chapter is talking about. It's risk-taking devotion. This is the kind of devotion that by definition is not sensible. It's not. It's terribly unwise from a human perspective, right? Why? Because it's putting all of our hopes, 100% of our future, all of our chances in the hands of Yahweh. With no backup plan, no option B, And so if things go belly up, we're stuffed. And yet this is the kind of devotion to God that the author is highlighting that we need. See, one of the things that we're tempted to do in the book of Ruth is put Ruth on this pedestal. You know, to look at her risk-taking devotion and go, wow, that's why she's in the Bible, right? She's pretty impressive. I mean, that's a one of a kind. She's a one of a kind. That's next level. That's like Elon Musk / Dave Goggins kind of Christian discipleship. Like, there's no way I can do that. I'm just a nobody. And yet, this is what I want us to realize this morning, that the text wants us to realize. This chapter is not highlighting Ruth as a superhero. The author is not emphasizing her risk-taking devotion to Yahweh as something special, as something out of the ordinary. He's showing us this is what faith looks like. This is what faith looks like. You see, faith isn't about having some cute theoretical framework that acts as a moral compass. Faith is not some philosophical construction that we add to our life, just like a dollop of purpose in life and meaning. That's not what faith is. Faith is walking in relationship and obedience to God, and doing so even when we can't see or understand how on earth God is still at work. Yeah. Faith is risk-taking devotion. It's saying, God, I don't know how I'm going to make this work. It's saying, I don't know where my income is going to come from if I don't work Sundays. It's saying, I don't know where I'm going to find quality family time if I don't prioritize it over you. It's saying, I don't know how we'll afford this house, or how we'll afford this trip, or do all of these wonderful things that my heart is desperate to do if I don't put them first. What if I miss out? And friends, that's the risk of faith. That's risk-taking devotion. Because here's the reality. God doesn't, everyone say doesn't, God doesn't promise us all of these things in this life. God does promise a reward, but it's an eternal one. And our reward fully kicks in when we leave this mortal body and this earth. But I want to say this, and catch this. While God does not owe us anything, while He doesn't guarantee that we're going to walk around in Prada, it is my experience, and it is a biblical principle from cover to cover, that when we do live with the kind of risk-taking devotion that makes genuine our faith claims, that God can't help but spill over the blessing that's stored up for us in heaven, here and now in the present. It's just what He does. He just can't contain it. He's like, I got too much of this. And if you're happy to be this devoted and this risk-taking, then I just can't help but give you some now. This is exactly what He does with Ruth. Let's look at Boaz's response to her risk-taking devotion in verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, well, a little bit behind. Then Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go and glean in another field, right? Don't play the field, literally, right? Don't hedge your bets. Don't take options. Furthermore, don't go from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be fixed on the field which they reap and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. Implied message, this foreigner woman was up for a lot of strife in a foreign land if there wasn't some kind of provision or person, looking out for her safety. Then he goes, when you are thirsty, Go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. And just in case we think that surely Ruth hasn't been that audacious to ask to glean among the harvested sheaves, look at what Boaz says in verse 15. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also, you shall purposefully pull out for her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. Wow. So not only, catch this, not only does Ruth make this crazy, audacious request as she outworks her risk-taking devotion to Naomi/Yahweh, but Boaz/Yahweh grants it. And not only does he grant it, but he gives her and some. Boaz not only tells Ruth that she can glean among the sheaves, but tells his employees to intentionally pull out some of the grain that's ready to be threshed and ready to be used and drop it intentionally for Ruth in front of her path. Not only this, he says, drink from my vessels. Let my men, my resource, let them get your water and come and eat my provisions at lunchtime. Let me put that in the 21st century for you. This is what he's saying. He's effectively saying, you're welcome to use the staff room. That's what he's saying. You get to have staff perks, health insurance, gym, these fancy places in Melbourne, they have like bars and gyms and all these things, at work these days. Because young people just don't know how to work. A bit of hard work these days. Sorry, that was a low one. But he literally said, you get to have the staff perks and you're not a staff member. You're a cleaner and you're a foreigner. Ruth is obviously blown away. And so we see the theme of this chapter come full circle in her response. Read this. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me since I'm a foreigner? Boaz replied to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be paid from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Here is the powerful truth of this exchange. You ready for it? Risk-taking devotion to Yahweh, risk-taking devotion to Yahweh results in God's favor. Risk-taking devotion to Yahweh results in God's favor. Ruth says, why have I found favor? Why am I the object of your blessing and provision? And what's Boaz's response? It's because you acted with risk-taking devotion. That's why. And this morning, this is the author's message to us about God. If we want to find favor in God's sight, if we want to experience the kind of blessing and provision and fullness of life that you hear about in the Bible, that you read about in popular autobiographies by Christian missionaries, if we want to experience that, then the answer is this: risk-taking devotion. Not play the field devotion. Not keep your options open devotion. Not I'm buckling under the pressure because things are tough devotion. But I'm betting betting the flippin' farm. I'm putting everything that I am and that I have on the character and the promises of Yahweh and His kind devotion to me. That's risk-taking devotion. That's, catch it, that's faith. And as the writer of Hebrews says, without faith, it's what? It's impossible to please Him. Friends, we live in a culture and a context where the devil wants nothing more than for churchgoers and Christians to live with lukewarm devotion to Yahweh. To get lost in the entertainment, the fanfare, the pleasures, the justifications of treating our devotion to God like a well-diversified investment portfolio, right? Mitigating risk by hedging our bets. That is literally what we're being invited to in the culture and the context of our society. The reality is this. The reality of the second chapter of Ruth is this. That kind of devotion does not win God's favor. That kind of devotion is not faith. I don't care what you grew up saying. I don't care what someone taught you in Sunday school or primary school or anywhere else. Faith is not some hyperbole that we say to ourselves to make ourselves feel good, or some inner kind of conviction, or some little chant that we go, oh, well, in deep inside I believe in God. That is not faith. Faith is what Ruth does. It's risk-taking devotion, saying, I'm going to do anything and everything for you, Yahweh, for your kingdom and for your provision. That's faith. So the question that this chapter asks us this morning is, will we be people of faith? We say we're people of faith. Will we live as people of faith? And I have good news for you this morning, and it's this. What the best part of risk-taking devotion is? It's this. You don't need any special skills. Think about this. You don't need any special skills to have risk-taking devotion. You don't need to be sin-free. You don't need to have a perfect track record. You don't need to know lots about the Bible or have some theological understanding of God. You don't need some crazy gift from the Holy Spirit. You know what you need? To trust Yahweh and take a risk for His sake. Anyone can do it, from a little kid to an older person. That's the beauty of faith. It's not bound by some special recipe. It's not bound by, some prerequisites. It's risk-taking devotion. It's being like Ruth and saying, you know what, God? I have no idea how this bad boy is going to turn out, but I trust you. And so I'm going to live and I'm going to walk in a manner that proves that, a manner of risk-taking devotion. So this morning, as we close, I want you to be stirred by that challenge. You see, Jesus says, come follow me, but Ruth tells us how. With risk-taking devotion. Don't let the enemy fool you. God's not stupid. You can't compartmentalize your heart and life and go, just give God this little bit, He'll be happy. That's fine, you can do that. Life and faith is not about making God happy. Life and faith is about experiencing what life is like when the Creator of the universe starts pouring blessing and favor and unprecedented amount of love and commitment on you as someone who doesn't deserve it. And the only way you experience that is risk-taking devotion. Amen? Let's pray.